Sometimes we become so consumed with whether we're following a rule that we set up for ourselves that we lose sight of the ultimate benefit we wanted to experience through having the rule in the first place. So while rules are, of course, helpful, sometimes they don't account for the day-to-day fluctuations that are a natural part of our human experience that we should be paying attention to. And even though we may have an inclination to deviate from the rules sometimes, we can view deviation as a sign of weakness or a lack of dedication. So in this episode, we'll discuss how instead of filling your day with hard and fast rules, we might benefit from a different approach, which is establishing a set of work principles instead. Here we go. Hey, welcome to the Workday Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Drew Amoroso. Every workday we encounter dozens of situations that we have to navigate in order to have a successful and productive workday. And the way you choose to think through those situations helps shape not only the kind of day you have, but the trajectory of your career. This podcast is all about helping you to navigate those situations, show up at your best, and be happier at work. I've been thinking a lot about rules recently, both the kind of rules that we set up for ourselves and also the reasons that we decide to set up rules in the first place. Now, I'm not against rules and I'm not against guidelines and having structure, but I will tell you, as someone who's been training and observing people for years now as they go about setting up rules during their day, I have observed a natural tension that exists when everything in our day is governed by rules. So here's the challenge I think we come up against when we move through a day that's governed completely by rules. Instead of staying focused on the end goal that we set up the rules for in the first place, we end up focusing on whether we're following the rules or not. So in other words, when we set up strict rules for ourselves, sometimes we get so consumed with whether we're following the rules that we lose sight of the ultimate benefit we wanted to experience from having the rules in the first place. And in addition to that, if we don't follow the rules, we as human beings are very expert at spending an inordinate amount of time judging ourselves for not following them. So let me give you an example from my workday. When I left my big law job and started my own law firm, I set up a rule where I was at my desk and working by 8 a.m. every morning. And I put this rule into place because I think I wanted to give myself a sense of structure and discipline. And for me, that worked for a while, but eventually I started to feel this major resistance to being at my desk by 8 a.m. every morning. So I'd wake up at 6 a.m. to start my day, and I already had this anxiety about this rule that I'd established. And it was like this looming deadline, like the moment I woke up, this clock was ticking and I could feel this sense of pressure building. So instead of enjoying the morning or preparing myself for the day, I was already feeling resentful that I had this timeline in place. And so I thought, well, maybe I just won't make this a rule and I'll start my day whenever I want to start. But as soon as that thought crossed my mind, I ended up beating up on myself for not being someone who is capable of following that rule. Like, why aren't you more disciplined? Other people start work on time. Many people start work earlier than 8. Get your act together. Push through. Toughen up. You must not care enough about growing your business or helping your clients. What about all those stories of successful people that you've heard about who worked around the clock? They wouldn't have a problem starting at 8. And I remember telling myself these stories and thinking for months about this, having this internal struggle over following this arbitrary rule that I set up for myself. And there was this natural tension that was created between wanting to follow the rule and this feeling that something wasn't right about the rule. In addition to experiencing this myself, now that I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of professionals on how to design their workday, I've noticed time and time again that this natural tension presents itself almost universally across the board. And the more I've studied what helps people really move through their workday with a sense of flow and what helps them feel fulfilled and have a sense of achievement, I've come to believe that for many people, setting up an elaborate set of rules may actually be detrimental overall. And here's why I think that hard and fast rules can sometimes be detrimental. Our bodies and our minds are in a constant state of flux. So we're a mix of how our physical body feels, our emotional state, our mental state, And in addition to all of that, we're taking in and we're susceptible to a whole bunch of inputs that affect us and that vary themselves day to day. So our environment, the weather, noise, light, temperature, other people, the changing of the seasons, a whole bunch of things. So there are many things that are constantly fluctuating each and every day that cause us to show up in a unique and different state every day. And as much as we think we have the ability to control how we show up, and we do have a lot of influence over how we show up, as much as we think that, there are certain things that are ultimately out of our reach that no amount of perseverance or discipline could account for. So one of the challenges with the rigidity of rules is that they don't allow for and they ultimately block out all of these mini fluctuations that we experience in ourselves that are not only natural, but that we should be paying very close attention to. Like, I'm feeling more tired today. I'm feeling more energized today. I'm feeling less energized today. I'm feeling focused. I'm a little sad today. I've had a bunch of random interruptions today. I'm ultra focused today. Those types of mini fluctuations are part of the human experience. They're the result of universal natural laws that we are all susceptible to. And so when we're fixated on the rigidity of following a rule, sometimes we end up blocking out things that we may desperately need in the moment to show up at our best in that moment. And the need may be contrary to our rule. And because we're so married to the idea of the importance of these rules, we can sometimes ignore the signs that are telling us what we need. And if we start to have this feeling that we should deviate from the rule that we've set up, like, for example, the way I started to feel like I wanted to deviate from my hard deadline of starting at 8 a.m., when we start to feel like we need to deviate, we interpret that as a sign of weakness or incapability, right? We see it as a lack of dedication or as a lack of discipline. And then we proceed with judging ourselves for not being able to follow the rules like everyone else does. And I'm putting everyone else in heavy quotation marks. So here's what I want to suggest to you. What if the desire to deviate from a rule you've established is actually you just listening to what you need in that moment? What if the desire to deviate is a sign that you've grown past an old rule that doesn't serve you anymore or that you just don't need anymore? What if the desire to deviate from your rules is actually you experiencing a growth point? What if it's not a lack of discipline, but instead it's your innate wisdom telling you that what you've set up for yourself just isn't working in that moment? So I want to bring this back to a way that we can reframe the idea of rules. Instead of rules, I want you to consider whether you might benefit from, in some cases, adopting principles instead of rules. So we all know what a principle is, but at a fundamental level, a principle is a truth or belief that serves as the foundation for a belief system or behaviors or for a chain of reasoning, right? It's a concept that governs your thoughts and your actions. And I like the idea of setting up work principles in some instances because it doesn't have the same rigidity that a rule does. If you follow a principle, it allows you to place yourself along a spectrum that no matter where you are on that spectrum, you are still following a principle that serves you, right? You allow yourself to move back and forth based on the natural fluctuations that we know from experience are going to be a part of who we are forever and always. It also accounts for the fact that we are constantly learning and growing. And if you're someone who's constantly learning and growing, then that also means you likely are constantly transcending rules that you've established. You're growing past old frameworks. You're growing past old guidelines that no longer fit you because you've outgrown them. So let me just offer you another example here before I lose you on just the theory. Going back to my example, my work rule was I start work at 8 a.m. every day without exception. And eventually I realized that that wasn't suiting me. And if I looked closely at why I had established that rule, That was just an arbitrary deadline that I imposed on myself without any real meaning. So then I asked the question, well, what's the principle that I want to follow? What's the reason or the belief I want to use to determine when to start my day? And the answer to that question was, I want to start my day at a time when I'm ready and believe that starting at this point will allow me to have the best day possible and also show up at my best. So I flipped from I'm starting my day at a certain time to I'm giving myself permission to start my day at a point on a spectrum where I feel ready to start. So the principle I adopted was the belief that I would have a better workday if I started at a time when I felt the most ready. So some mornings I want to get started at 7 a.m. and other mornings I feel like I'm ready to start at 9:30. And giving myself that permission allows me to consistently show up at my best because I'm accounting for those fluctuations. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't have that much freedom in my day, I have other people I have to report to, and I generally have a hard start time, I'll tell you that this is not an all or nothing proposition. Sometimes our ability to do things like start or end our day is out of our control. But again, that's why I like the idea of a spectrum, because it allows for things like other people or circumstances outside of our control to enter our lives without judgment and without causing us to spiral into a poor mindset because we haven't followed a rule. Now, I want to be very crystal clear on this next point. This is not a ding on perseverance or structure or the power of repetition when it comes to daily routines and habits. So I'm not suggesting that you don't push through challenges or things that are hard, or that you give up on routines that you want to build because you encounter some resistance to them. If you truly believe that starting work every day at 8 a.m. is serving you, then you should continue to do it. What I'm inviting you to consider, though, is whether the rules that you set up for yourself are actually serving you. Do the rules that you've put in place actually have a purpose? Or are they just some sort of rule that maybe you observed someone else following at a formative time in your development, right? Is it a cultural narrative that you think you have to follow in order to be considered productive or in order to be taken seriously, right? The question is this rule serving you? And again, if the answer is yes, I need this rule, I thrive on this rule, sometimes it's uncomfortable, but ultimately there's a net benefit to having it, then you should keep it. But if you're continually feeling this sense of misalignment with rules that you've set up, it's also okay to release yourself from the burden of a rule that no longer fits you. And you can choose to establish a principle that reflects the natural spectrum that you operate on, and that ultimately will help you achieve what you want in the end. So, what's our takeaway? If you're feeling out of alignment with a rule that you've set up for yourself, there's 3 questions here that I think you can consider that might help you work through it. The first question is, why have I set up this rule? So what's the reason? Going back to my example, I couldn't think of a good reason why I said I'm going to start at 8 a.m. I think I picked 8 a.m. because most people start at 9 a.m. and I wanted to overachieve. So I said, I'll start at 8. I'll show them that I'm really dedicated. I'm up by 6 a.m. and I'm at my desk by 8. Look at how disciplined and dedicated I am. But ultimately, that is a silly reason to set up that rule, right? It's a nonsensical reason to do that. So ask yourself, why have I set up this rule in the first place? Question 2 is, what's the ultimate outcome I want to achieve? So what's the benefit to having some structure or a rule in place? Now, in my example, the ultimate outcome I actually wanted was to have an incredibly productive day where I was feeling prepared and happy and making progress and enjoying my work and showing up at my best. That's really what I wanted. I didn't care about starting work at 8 a.m. I wanted to have a full, amazing day. So if you find yourself in conflict with a rule, ask yourself, what's the ultimate benefit that I want from this rule? Then finally, question 3 is, would I benefit from reframing this rule into a principle? So can you turn what was a rule into a principle that has a purpose behind it? And that may offer you some flexibility, and that allows you to account for the natural push and pull that we experience each day, and that might release you from the judgment or from beating up on yourself if you choose to deviate from that rule. And again, I reframe my rule into the principle that I would start work when I felt like I was ready to start. Now, on some days, was it outside of my control? Absolutely, yes. But overall, the start of my workday aligns with how I feel that day, which in the aggregate helps me to show up at my best and releases me from the self-judgment I may have felt from breaking an arbitrary rule that I established. So remember, being someone who's focused on following hard and fast rules really only has value if there's something truly meaningful behind that rule. And I would encourage you to look at the rules that you've set up and consider whether there's a stronger, more purposeful principle that you might adopt that has the potential to get you farther. Go have a great workday. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of the Workday Mindset Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd appreciate it if you could head over to whatever service you're using to tune in and give us a 5-star review. The Workday Mindset Podcast is a collaboration with Populous Radio. Check out their other shows at populousradio.com. Thanks for tuning in, and go get them.